By the time Marquis Smith rolled onto a stage in a wheelchair, he had already outlived most of the scenes that once claimed him. His liver was failing, his lungs were wrecked, his teeth were a rumor, but the contract he had signed with himself back in the late 1970s still applied. Rock and roll is a job, and you don't clock off because you feel unwell. Roadies moved amps around him like nurses shifting drip stands. The band, younger, healthier, interchangeable, locked into the same kind of grinding riffs he'd been ordering for decades. He leaned into the microphone, barked out lines half the room could not fully decode, and in that moment looked less like a frontman than a factory worker who had refused to leave the line even as it caught fire. The question is not why he kept going. The question is what had built this obligation in the first place. To answer that, you have to go back to Salford, to a council estate, a low-paid desk job, a country shutting down piece by piece. Marquis Smith watched Britain pretend that everything was under control and came to a conclusion that would shape the rest of his life. If the world is already corrupt and collapsing, there is no moral duty for art to be pleasant. The fall became his proof. The price of that proof would be paid slowly and publicly by his own body. For most people outside Britain, his name was never at the top of posters. But if you have ever heard a band talk more than sing, ride a single riff into the ground on purpose, sneer at their own audience and at the idea of being nice, you have heard his fingerprints. He became what musicians call a musician's musician. Not the man selling millions of records, but the blueprint other bands stole from without always admitting it. His legacy would be carved not in platinum discs, but in the attitude of bands who had never met him and were still unknowingly working to a template he wrote. He did not start life anywhere near a blueprint. Mark was born in 1957 in Broughton, Salford, into a working-class family in a city that had once been an engine of the industrial world and was now living with the rust. His childhood landscape was red brick terraces, canal water that never quite looked clean, corner shops with flickering strip lights, pubs that emptied out onto pavements thick with cigarette ends. People worked in factories, offices, on building sites. When they lost those jobs, they went to the pub to talk about how nothing ever changed and how everything was getting worse. As a kid, he learned early that the grown-up world did not owe you explanations. Bills appeared, parents argued in lowered voices about money and work, neighbors vanished from one house and appeared thinner and angrier in another. On walks through Salford with his mother, he would clock the details adults pretended not to see. The way paint peeled faster on council doors than on the semi-detached houses a few streets over. The boys slightly older than him already hanging around the bookies in the afternoon. The factory siren that still rang out, even though half the windows in the building behind it were smashed. He did not romanticize any of it. Later, when journalists tried to make him into a spokesman for gritty realism, he bristled. To him, it had not been material. It had been the water he swam in, the reason his patience for fantasy, musical or political, was near zero. School did not rescue him. He was clever enough to be bored and bored enough to be disruptive. Teachers saw a kid who could have done better and resented the fact that he did not much care. He saw teachers as another branch of the same machine that kept people in their place. He read, but not what he was told to. Pulp sci-fi paperbacks, lurid horror, cheap editions of Kafka and Camus picked up from second-hand shops, the racing pages of the newspaper, council notices on the wall at the housing office. He absorbed language the way other kids collected football stickers. Books, when they arrived sideways. A well-meaning teacher passed him a battered copy of The Trial and suggested that, if he insisted on reading in class, he might as well read something difficult. An older cousin left behind a stack of science fiction paperbacks full of paranoid bureaucracies and malfunctioning systems. At the library, where nobody paid much attention so long as he kept quiet, he would pick things almost at random. An anthology of modern poetry, a book on UFO sightings, a manual for office etiquette. What stuck were not plots but tones, the flat report of Kafka's absurd horrors, the clipped instructions of management speak, the overheated evangelism of self-help. Years later, when he began to write lyrics, those voices all leaked out at once. He would take a bit of bureaucratic phrasing, twist it until it sounded sinister, then shove it up against something mythic or obscene. It was not theory. It was instinct built from years of absorbing mismatched language without anyone telling him how he was supposed to react. By his late teens, he had done the responsible thing that responsible people kept telling him to do. He got a job. Not in a studio, not on a stage, but at the docks and then in an office, a low-paid clerical post in Manchester. He typed, filed, stamped, processed. He watched men twice his age staring at the clock, counting down to the cigarette break, the lunch hour, the end of shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The radio in the corner played whatever slick American or soft rock single was climbing the charts. To most of the room it was background. To him it was evidence. Around him whole industries were shutting down in slow motion. Newspapers called it restructuring. People in pubs called it getting shafted. Young men a few years older than Mark went from apprenticeships to unemployment in the space of a government announcement. The sense that history was happening somewhere else, in London, in Brussels, on American television, settled like dust on the streets he walked home at night. In that atmosphere, escapist music felt like a lie too far. He did not want lullabies for adults. He wanted something that sounded like a row in a shared kitchen at 3 a.m, or the thud of boots on a stairwell when a landlord came to collect overdue rent. If no one else was going to make that noise on purpose, he decided, he would have to. If this was adulthood, he thought, something had gone badly wrong. The country pretended that this slow decay was normal, inevitable, manageable. Politicians on television talked about restructuring and modernization. In Salford, it looked like boarded-up shops and men queuing at the dole office. Under those conditions, the idea that music had a moral obligation to be soothing, good company, felt not just wrong but offensive. If the system was ugly, he reasoned, honest art had to be at least as ugly back. In June 1976, he went to a gig in Manchester that would later be mythologized into a holy relic, the Sex Pistols at the Lesser Free Trade Hall. People argue to this day about who was in the room, future members of Joy Division, the Smiths, even the Buzzcocks themselves. For Mark, who was there in the sweat and spit, the important thing was not who else was watching, but what he was watching not happen. The band was basic. The sound was shoddy. The guitar playing was hardly more advanced than what you could manage after a month with a cheap instrument. But the gap between stage and floor had shrunk to almost nothing. There was no illusion of virtuoso genius. There was a noise, a voice, and an attitude that said, you can do this too, and if you don't, someone else will, and they will not be better people than you. What struck him most that night in the Lesser Free Trade Hall was not just the energy, or the swearing, or even the sight of a band apparently held together with tape and spite. It was the discovery that competence had been demoted. You no longer had to be a guitar hero or a trained singer to get on stage. You just had to decide that you were less willing to watch rubbish than to risk making your own. Standing in that packed, half-chaotic room, he saw a kind of democracy that had nothing to do with ballot boxes. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Terrifying because it removed excuses. Liberating because it suggested that the distance between clerk and performer was not as fixed as it had always been sold to him. Where some people saw a scene, he saw an opening. He went back to Salford with a new job description in his head. He didn't want to be the Sex Pistols, too obviously destined for the tabloids, too much theater where he wanted interrogation. But he wanted a band that could be a vehicle for everything he hated and everything he saw, one that would sound like the city he lived in and the thoughts he did not hear on the radio. Within months, he and a few friends from the local scene had scrabbled together the first lineup of what would become the Fall. Those first rehearsals did not look like the birth of anything that would last. They took place in bare rooms that smelt of damp and beer, with equipment held together by tape and willpower. Some of the players had barely learned their instruments. Mark could bash at a guitar, keep time on a drum, but he understood quickly that his real strength wasn't playing. It was speaking. He started bringing in notebooks filled with phrases, fragments, overheard insults, odd bits of religious language, and office jargon. Songs were not written so much as assembled. A drummer would find a beat he could keep going for 5, 7, 10 minutes. A bass player would lock onto something stubborn and simple. A guitarist would scrape at a pattern, trying not to fall off. Over the top, Mark would test lines, shouting, mumbling, spitting them out until one lodged like a piece of glass. Those stayed. Their first gigs sounded by most conventional standards terrible. There were tuning problems, timing problems, entire songs that appeared to be built on one chord because nobody felt confident enough to move to another. Smith did not apologize. If someone shouted that they were rubbish, he would agree, then add something worse. "You should have stayed at home," he might say into the mic. "But then so should I." The aggression was not only aimed outward, it was a way of burning off the embarrassment that comes with learning in public. He treated each show as a test, not of talent, but of stubbornness. Were they willing to stand there under bad lights, taking abuse and confusion and the occasional flying glass, and keep playing anyway? If the answer was yes, they were one step closer to being useful. They named the band after a Camus novel, The Fall. It sounded serious, which was partly the joke. By hitching himself to that title, he was saying a few things at once: that this would not be fun in the usual sense, that they were starting in decline rather than aiming for a rise, that he did not believe in the stories British rock told about itself, the heroic ascent from working-class nobody to stadium savior. For him, the fall had already happened. The music would be a report from the impact zone. The first shows were more like confrontations than concerts. They played pubs where nobody had asked for them, support slots where the headliner's fans were actively hostile, tiny clubs where half the crowd left after 2 songs. The guitars were thin and sharp, the drums out of time just enough to keep you unsettled, the bass lines looping like industrial machinery. Over this chaos, Smith talked and shouted and sneered, occasionally hitting something that sounded like melody, more often drilling a phrase into the air until it became strange. Some nights people shouted back. Some nights they sat frozen. Either reaction pleased him more than polite applause. Word got out through the only route available to bands like that in late 70s Britain: small fanzines, whispers in record shops, the rare sympathetic review. And then John Peel heard them. Peel, a BBC DJ with both national reach and a personal taste for the difficult, invited the Fall in for one of his late-night sessions. For 4 songs, recorded quickly and cheaply in a BBC Maida Vale studio in 1978, this band from Salford used public money to beam their version of reality into bedrooms across the country. The session felt to them like a job shift on a different production line. They arrived hauling guitars and drums, eyes gritty from motorway travel and cheap lager. The BBC engineer asked them to tune. Smith shrugged. "It's in tune with itself," he might as well have said. They ran through the songs at what passed for full intensity, while in the control room Peel grinned, half in delight, half in recognition that a good portion of his audience would hate every minute. When the tapes were played out on air, the phone lines and letters confirmed it. Some listeners swore they would never trust Peel again. Others wrote to say that finally someone on national radio sounded like the country they actually lived in. For a whole generation of awkward teenagers, those Peel sessions functioned as proof of concept. You could be clever, furious, funny in a way that most adults would call rude, and still make something that left a mark. In towns where the only live music was cover bands in pubs, the idea that this strange, lurching noise was coming from people not that much older than you was like a crack in the wall. Some future musicians heard the fall and thought, "I want to sound like that." Others thought, "I never want to sound like that, but I want the same freedom to ignore the rules." Smith never sat down to plan mentorship, but somewhere at kitchen tables and in bedrooms, kids were copying his willingness to sound wrong on purpose. From that point on, the Fall and John Peel were welded together. Over the years, they would record more sessions for his program than any other band. For teenagers scattered across provincial towns doing homework in damp bedrooms or killing time before another shift, those broadsides became a kind of education. The music announced itself as hostile territory, but for those who stuck with it, there was a strange kind of welcome in being addressed without condescension. Smith was not trying to make friends. He was trying to tell you what he saw, on his terms, at his volume. Inside the band, the environment that produced this work was anything but stable. From the late 70s through the 80s and beyond, the Fall became notorious for their rotating cast. Guitarists, bassists, drummers, keyboard players, even partners came and went. By the end of Smith's life, more than 60 musicians had passed through the group. Some left with stories of the best music they ever made. Others left with stories of the worst boss they ever had. Both could be true. He enforced his vision not with inspirational speeches, but with a mixture of sarcasm, sudden warmth, and outright intimidation. Rehearsals could turn on a word. If he liked the way you played, he might say nothing at all. Silence is the closest he came to praise. If he didn't, you would know within seconds. On stage, his control was even more visible. There are recordings and eyewitness accounts of nights where, mid-song, he would stalk across the stage to turn down an amp he decided was too loud, or yank a cable out of a guitar whose tone offended him. Once, when a new member took an intro too slowly, Mark allegedly stepped up to the mic and announced within earshot of everyone, "You're fucking it up already." The song started again, faster. For most people, that kind of treatment would be intolerable. For some, it was. They quit or were fired, sometimes mid-tour, sometimes mid-song. Others accepted it as the price of admission. The logic, as Smith saw it, was simple. The Fall was not a collective, it was a vehicle. "If it's me and your granny on bongos, it's still the Fall," he liked to say, half joke, half law. What mattered was that the parts did their jobs. If a part broke, you replaced it. The machine carried on. This idea of work ran through everything. Where other bands spoke about muse or inspiration, he spoke about shifts and output. Songs were structures to be built and then lived in for a while, not sacred artifacts. On tour, the group was expected to function like a mobile factory. Travel, load in, sound check, blast through the set, pack up, move on. There was drinking, fighting, laughing, but underneath it lay a rhythm as rigid as any assembly line. The difference was that this line belonged to him. The 1980s dragged the Fall into strange proximities with mainstream recognition. Albums like Hex Induction Hour, Perverted by Language, and This Nation's Saving Grace were never going to sit beside the era's polished pop records on the radio. But they carved out a space that critics and other musicians revered. When Brick Smith, the Californian guitarist he married, joined the band in the mid-80s, the sound took on a new sheen. Brighter guitars, sharper hooks, songs that, to the horror of some purists, you could imagine non-obsessed friends enjoying. The late 80s brought an especially strange tension. For once, the outside world seemed to be catching up. Music papers put the fall on the cover. Television producers, desperate for something that looked alternative but would not terrify the advertisers, booked them for late-night slots. Watching the footage now, you can see two realities rubbing against each other. The band, tightened by relentless touring and Brix's pop instincts, sounds almost sleek. Smith, in a blazer that fits better than his old charity shop jackets, prowls the stage with all his usual menace. The cameras try to frame him as a charismatic frontman. He keeps slipping the frame, turning away, muttering lines off mic, refusing the obvious big moment. It is as if he has been handed, for a brief second, a more conventional version of success, and cannot resist kicking the tires until it falls apart. For a while it worked. Records sold in decent numbers. They appeared on television. There was even something you could call a hit single. Yet every step towards broader approval made Smith more uncomfortable. He distrusted exposure, seeing in it not validation but dilution. The more people understood the fall, the more he worried they had misunderstood them. So, as often happened in his life, sabotage arrived disguised as integrity. He drank more. He picked more fights. Relationships inside the band grew tense, then broke. The marriage to Brix collapsed under the weight of addiction, temper, conflicting ambitions. When she left, a certain brightness left the music with her. The lineup shifted again. The group lurched through the early 90s, putting out records that alternated between scathing clarity and chaotic mess. Live shows could be transcendent or shambolic from one night to the next. To outsiders, it looked like a slow-motion disaster. To those inside, it felt like business as usual, if your definition of business included regular screaming matches and sudden resignations. By the mid-90s, the internal contradictions turned into open collapse. One notorious American tour ended in a hotel room fight that spilled into police reports and court dates, with band members nursing bruises and lawyers arguing over who had hit whom. In the press, it was easy to reduce the story to the usual rock and roll cliches: drink, drugs, violence. Inside that chaos, the dynamic was uglier and simpler. A man who had built his authority on never backing down from a confrontation found himself incapable of de-escalating, even when the people he needed most were standing in front of him. Each argument won on principle cost him another collaborator, another friendship. The lineup after each implosion grew younger, less likely to challenge him, more willing to accept that constant turmoil was just how the fall operated. The band survived, but the circle around him shrank. Even as his behavior became more erratic, his antenna for hypocrisy remained sharp. He aimed his lyrics not just at obvious targets, politicians, bosses, police, but at fellow musicians, at scenes, at any group he felt was playing dress-up as working class while enjoying arty comfort. He mocked bands for faking accents, for borrowing working-class imagery as costume. He went after journalists for lazy tropes, after fans for wanting the same old songs instead of new irritations. There was something bracing in that refusal to flatter anyone. There was also something exhausting about living at a constant level of attack. In 2004, when John Peel died suddenly of a heart attack, it closed a circle. For the fall, Peel had been more than a broadcaster. He was a pressure valve, a shield, someone inside a major institution who believed that the band's existence made the cultural ecosystem less dishonest. Without him, there was one less advocate in the room when decision-makers asked why anyone should care about a group whose leader seemed determined to insult them. Smith felt the loss personally. One of the few authority figures he had ever publicly respected was gone, and professionally. The phone still rang, but one vital line went dead. Peel's death also forced Smith to consider, however briefly, what happened to people who outlived their allies. At the funeral, surrounded by musicians who owed their first national airplay to the same quiet man in the BBC booth, he was no longer the awkward outsider snarling at institutions. He was part of a generation suddenly confronted with its own mortality, a room full of once radicals now edging into respectability. In interviews afterwards, he kept his tone brisk, even dismissive, but the loss showed in other ways. The records that followed sounded at times like someone arguing with ghosts, less concerned with being ahead of the curve than with proving he hadn't been absorbed by it. By then, his body was no longer an abstract future problem. Decades of drinking, smoking, and erratic living had left visible marks. His face had thinned and sagged. His teeth had decayed into a jagged landscape. He was diagnosed with various conditions that, in another line of work, might have prompted serious lifestyle changes. Instead, he made adjustments just enough to keep moving. Shows were shortened, schedules tweaked. The basic pattern, work, travel, drink, perform, repeat, remained. In 2017, images began circulating of the fall, performing with Smith in a wheelchair. For some fans, it was the moment the abstract idea of his mortality slammed into view. On stage, he looked both diminished and utterly himself. Seated, he still barked orders at the band, still fiddled with amps, still spat lyrics like complaints. Roadies hovered like medical staff, adjusting cables, shifting monitors around the chair. In poor lighting, he could have been a patient wheeled into the wrong ward and deciding while he was there to start running the place. The ethics of these shows were murky. Was this dedication, a man determined to do his job until the end? Was it exploitation, by others, by himself? Fans debated it in pubs and online. Some swore off buying tickets, feeling complicit in watching a sick man run himself into the ground. Others went precisely because they felt they owed him their presence, a way of saying thank you for decades of uncomfortable solidarity. Smith, characteristically, did not invite the conversation. He turned up when he could, canceled when he couldn't, and in between treated each gig like another shift he had signed up for. Away from stages and studios, the day-to-day reality of his last years was less mythic and more mundane. There were hospital appointments, arguments about medication, brief resolutions to cut down that never quite stuck. Friends and partners describe him still scribbling in notebooks at kitchen tables, ashtray overflowing, television murmuring in the background, half watching horse racing or crime dramas while underlining a phrase that might later turn up in a song. The flat was both refuge and bunker. He would complain about the state of the country, the stupidity of politicians, the betrayal of scenes he had once helped birth. Then with the same breath berate himself for not getting more done that day. Even as his body failed, the notion that he might simply stop, retire, vanish, give up the fight, seemed not to occur to him as a real option. When death finally arrived in January 2018 from lung and kidney cancer, it felt less like an interruption and more like a system finally breaking under stress. He was 60, which in rock mythology is a surprising survival, and in ordinary human terms not old at all. Obituaries tried to make neat sense of what he had done. They called him iconoclastic, uncompromising, a curmudgeon, a poet of the working class. Some leaned hard on the stories of cruelty and chaos, others on the influence in the words, as if these could be separated. The truth, as always, sits uncomfortably between. Marquis Smith was a man who turned his contempt for the world into a body of work that made thousands of people feel seen in their own contempt. He was also a boss who hurt people, sometimes gratuitously, sometimes in ways they still struggle to talk about. He carved out a space in culture where ugliness was allowed to be honest, and in doing so often reproduced the same power dynamics he hated. One voice deciding, others adapting or leaving. His influence on music is easier to map than his moral legacy. You can draw a crooked line from The Fall to any band that trades in insistent repetition, half-spoken vocals, and lyrics that sound like overheard rants from a very intelligent drunk. You hear him in the way some groups wear their regional accents like armor rather than sanding them down for radio. You hear him in the decision to leave mistakes in, to prioritize feel over polish, to treat the studio not as a place to fix flaws but to document them. Listen closely to Radiohead's willingness in their early years to let songs wobble and fray, to LCD Sound System's monologues over disco-punk grooves, to countless indie bands shouting lists of grievances over 2 chords, and his DNA flickers through. Even artists who would never list The Fall as an influence borrow his license, the permission to be difficult, to not explain, to risk alienating more people than you attract. For younger musicians, he offers a kind of compass and a warning. The compass says, you do not have to be pleasant. You do not have to fit. You can build a world from your own obsessions and refuse entry to anyone who demands you tidy it up. The warning says if you build that world entirely on hostility, you may find that at the end, your only company is the echo of your own voice. Marquis Smith began as a clerk in a system he loathed and reinvented rock and roll as another kind of shift work. Louder, messier, but governed by the same assumption that you show up whether you feel like it or not. He turned his band into an assembly line that could never unionize against him, producing a catalog that is, in its way, one of the most consistent records of class anger and cultural distrust in British music. He refused to make friends and in doing so made more accidental allies than he might ever have wanted. The image of him in that wheelchair, still barking orders, is not just a tragic coda. It is the logical endpoint of the contract he wrote for himself in his 20s. If rock is a job, you do it until you cannot. The question his life leaves hanging is not whether that commitment was authentic. It clearly was. The question is whether a life spent fighting every external system is complete if you never turn the same uncompromising eye on the one system you run entirely. Your own habits of cruelty, your own addiction to conflict, your own belief that stopping is the same as surrender. Because if opposing everything around you is what keeps you honest, then at what point does resisting your own worst instincts, backing down from the grind you built, stepping away from the factory floor you refuse to leave, become the last and perhaps most necessary act of revolution?